So is Roger Craig Smith reprising his role as Chris Redfield in the next Resident Evil game? So the reason I wanted to make this video is essentially because a couple months ago when I did the interview with Roger Craig Smith, I had some comments that were essentially saying how Roger Craig Smith is actually, one of their favorite Chris Redfield, and basically you should have asked him if he's going to be returning as Chris Redfield in another Resident Evil game, like Resident Evil 9, for example. And the funny thing is that I actually did ask him this, and that's what we're discussing in today's video. Now, I should preface for those of you that don't know who Roger Craig Smith is. Roger Craig Smith has actually been with the series all the way back since Resident Evil Degeneration CGI movie. He's also been Chris Redfield in Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil Dark Side Chronicles, Resident Evil, both Revelation games, Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D. So he's been with the series for a very long time. Not only that, but he's also super well known as playing the voice of Sonic recently, and as well as Ezio Auditore di Firenze from the Assassin's Creed trilogy. The other thing that I should also mention is that the reason I didn't add this in my, my actual interview video is because this is actually something that I discussed with Roger before I did the interview. And the other thing too is that the expo had a very strict rule, essentially where you could not do a pre-interview with anybody and do like a recording. You couldn't do that. Like obviously you can go and meet them, which is what I did. You can talk with them, ask them a question, whatever, but you can't record and do an interview just from walking. And obviously the rule kind of sucked that I couldn't capture footage. But obviously I do, understand, the reason, because obviously sometimes, the actors walk the floors and obviously they don't want to be stopped and talked and do a live interview. That might be a little jarring for a lot of them. So it makes sense. I understand. But it still kind of sucked. Like, for example, I was walking right next to Cameron Monaghan and I had no idea. Like, literally, my brother told me about this. And I was like, oh, shoot, I had no idea. You should have told me. But anyways, the conversation I essentially had with Roger Craig Smith is that when I went up to him, I basically introduced myself. He was super nice. And that's when I actually asked him, I was like, dude, you're actually one of my favorite Chris Redfields. Every time I think of the character, I hear your voice. And so I basically asked him, like, is there any way that we could see you, like, in, I don't know, the next Resident Evil games? And he actually answered. He actually answered me. And this is basically what he said. He essentially said, well, you know what? I'm just an actor at the end of the day, so I can't, it's not up to me. I would love to just go back to the character. I really love the character of Chris Redfield, is what he essentially explained. But he then went on to say that a lot of the reasons why Capcom never rehired him after the events of Resident Evil 6, for Resident Evil 7, for example, or Resident Evil 8, is mostly due to union, he essentially said. He said that Capcom has a habit of sometimes hiring non-union actors and as well as union actors. So since that was always the case, that's what he was basically saying. Neil Newbon was also there. He also said how Neil was also a part of USA Union, but as well as the British Union Actors Guild. So whatever the equivalent of that is, I don't know the specific name for them. It was really cool that when I essentially asked him, he was very quick to answer. So it seems like a lot of people have asked him this question. And what was funny too is that as we were talking, he also did the come on Sheva, hurry! Come on Sheva, hurry! Like he did that voice line. But yeah, and then obviously the next day, that's when the interview happened. Now it is worth noting, as mentioned at the start of the video, Roger hasn't portrayed Chris since Revelations 2. And I don't even know if he was actually in the booth for that. Maybe they just reused a lot of the lines from Resident Evil 6. But anyways, Resident Evil 6, which happened in 2012, and as well as Revelations 2 in 2015. And then after, Capcom went in a completely different direction, right? I mean, that's when we essentially got the really like weird Chris's cousin vibe from Resident Evil 7 at the end of the game, which was honestly one of the worst parts of the game in my opinion, which is another reason I don't like Resident Evil 7, as many of you guys know. But yeah, that was also really weird. I actually don't remember who the actor was for that specific Chris. And then after, we actually ended up getting Jeff Sheen, I believe, or Jeff Shine. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. But I honestly thought he did a great job in Resident Evil Village portraying Chris. But the issue I had with this, and it's not just my issue, I noticed a lot of other, fans also noticed this, but it was very strange and kind of jarring as a gamer, as a viewer, that, that Jeff Sheen or Jeff Shine the year before, portrayed Carlos Oliveira and he essentially did the same exact voice for both of them. So that was a bit weird. Obviously, as mentioned, I think Jeff has a fantastic voice. I think he did a great job of kind of portraying Chris Redfield and Carlos, but I would have liked it if there's a bit of this, there was more of a distinction between the two characters, because as mentioned, it was just a little bit weird playing, RE3 and then moving to Resident Evil Village and being like, bro, this is like the same. Is this the same character? I'm confused.
I think we're in the clear.
Hope so.
We've been bringing survivors here.
Here where?
My guys have converted some subway cars into a shelter. It's safe.
I'm fine.
Personal space. Okay, I get it. Let's go.
Story short, Miranda's fucking insane. In this village, all these monsters and freaks, this is her life's work. Some sort of crazy experiment with the mold.
The mold. Like Louisiana. God damn it.
Obviously, Capcom does seem to have a habit of rehiring actors, which is what happened with Roger Craig Smith, right? I mean, since Degeneration, he came back, RE5, RE6, and the list goes on. So it's kind of just begs the question, is Capcom going to rehire Jeff, or are they going to bring in other, voice actors? It's worth noting that even if you look at Resident Evil Death Island, I was actually super shocked that they actually brought Leon S. Kennedy from Resident Evil 6, aka Matthew Mercer, who's also been in other CGI movies like Damnation and Resident Evil Vendetta. I thought it was kind of crazy. I was expecting it to be Nick Apostolides, especially after his great performance in Resident Evil 4 Remake with a much older Leon. Because that was always a question I always had before. I was always like, I really like Nick Apostolides' voice as younger Leon, but I wasn't too sure before, obviously, the release of Resident Evil 4 Remake, if that was going to be good, right? Like if young Leon was going to be, but obviously when Resident Evil 4 trailers and the game ended up, releasing, all of that worry kind of went out the window, because, Nick did such a fantastic job of sounding like an older, more experienced Leon. So it was a bit confusing also, because if we look at Infinite Darkness, which technically takes place 2 years after the events of Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4 obviously takes place in 2004, and then Resident Evil Infinite Darkness takes place in 2006. What was strange is that Nick's kind of performance for Leon in Resident Evil Infinite Darkness was still like young Leon from RE2, so that was a bit of an inconsistency. Obviously, RE4 Remake, it's a much experienced Leon, and then he goes back to being the RE2 Leon, essentially. So that's just a little nitpick that I had, but obviously I think Nick did a fantastic job. But all this to say is that, I think it was very interesting that Capcom essentially decided to rehire Leon from, the past. Matthew Mercer, who's also one of my favorite Leons. But the other thing that I should also mention too, speaking of Resident Evil Death Island, is that we also got the same version of Chris from Resident Evil Vendetta. So that was also kind of strange, right? It almost seems like Capcom doesn't really know what they're like. It seems like they're just hiring whatever actors they want for their projects. So that's basically kind of begs the question. It's definitely possible for us to get Roger Craig Smith to return as Chris Redfield. And as many fans were saying in my comment section, they definitely want to hear that. And the other thing that I should also mention too with my talk with Roger that kind of surprised me was the fact that Roger really knows the character inside and out. Like he really knows Resident Evil lore. That's very rare for actors, right? I mean, especially voice actors where, they're always doing different projects. And obviously Roger Craig is definitely in that bubble where he's like super busy. He's played so many iconic characters like Batman, right? Like as we discussed, Ezio, Sonic, even the list goes on. But it's kind of crazy that, after so many years, he still understands the character. He still understands the world of Resident Evil. So I think personally having him return as Chris Redfield, I think would be the best option in my opinion. But I wouldn't be opposed to having Jeff return as Chris Redfield. And another thing I really liked about Village as opposed to Resident Evil 7 was the fact that the creators, right, the devs essentially, scrapped the idea of having a more realistic Chris, look-alike. I thought their version of Chris Redfield was fantastic. I definitely saw him more as like, looking like a real person, which is what they were trying to do in Resident Evil 7. What they did in RE8, I think they really nailed it really well with the character's look. So yeah, I mean, hey, if we get Chris Redfield in Resident Evil 9, which is most likely the case, since, Chris and Leon are always in the net, they're always, how many video games have they been in now, right? Like, it's kind of a given that they're going to show up in the next one. But yeah, if we do get another Chris Redfield, or if Capcom decides to remake Code Veronica, I would love it if Roger Craig Smith returns. Anyways, click this video if you guys want to see my interview and let me know down in the comments. Do you guys think Roger Craig Smith should return as Chris Redfield? Anyways, thank you so much for watching.